today what we're going to cover is all about your agile role. And while we are focusing on your role within a voyage, this really is translates very well to your team role or your project role outside of Chingu. It's really structured for any Scrum environment. So let's just move right along. So first of all, who should you expect to be on your team? So again, this is specific to a Chingu Voyage, but most likely you will be in a team with a product owner, a Scrum Master, one or two UI UX designers, and then of course developers. Now there will always be developers on a team, but whether or not we can add a product owner, Scrum Master, or UI UX designer depends on how many people in those roles actually sign up for the voyage. So we don't know yet what the mix is exactly going to be in Voyage 55, but I can tell you, I'm sure that every team will have a Scrum Master, and most, if not all teams, will have a product owner. Really, the big question at this point is how many UI UX designers we have. So very quickly, let's go through the responsibilities of each of these roles. So a product owner's job is to manage the product backlog. The backlog is essentially it's the record of all the tasks that your team has identified that you need to complete in order to deliver a minimum viable product. So those tasks, we're not really going to dive into what is an epic or a user story, but at least in a voyage, you will have epics, which are very broad, high-level statements of functionality. They are broken down into user stories, which are specific bits of functionality to deliver to the users. And then finally, there are tasks underneath the user stories. And tasks are the individual, both technical and non-technical things that you have to complete in order to deliver a working product. So the product owner's job is to basically manage that product backlog. And we'll go into what that means a little bit later. Now, as part of that managing process, though, the product owner will prioritize the features and the PBIs. PBIs are product backlog items. That's basically a generic term for the epics, the user stories, and the tasks in the backlog. Now, these roles they don't operate in a vacuum. The product owner isn't doing prioritization of features without talking to the rest of the team. And likewise, when you go to the developers and the UI UX designers, their job is to create and deploy the application in these increments, what we call a done increment. But they're not doing that in a vacuum. They're working with the product owner and the Scrum Master. Now, the Scrum Master manages the Scrum process. And we'll show you what that is in a minute if you're not familiar with Scrum. It's basically a specific Agile framework that's built around the Agile methodology. And you've probably heard me say before that there are multiple different Agile frameworks. Scrum is just one of them. Now, I think it's pretty safe to say, it's the most popular one out there right now. But there are others, like test-driven development is considered to be an Agile framework built on top of the Agile methodology, as is extreme programming, or XP, which is essentially, it's pair programming on steroids. Now, another task of or responsibility of the Scrum Master is to remove anything that's blocking the progress of the team. So that could be something technical. It could be that, there's a bug that you've encountered in your front-end framework. The Scrum Master is not necessarily a technical person. They aren't necessarily equipped to know the technical answers, but what they are able to do is to help you navigate through things like like a product uh, issue reporting site, or maybe finding some other Chingu that's not in your team that knows about this issue or about this technical feature that can help you resolve the issue. The other thing that in traditional Scrum, the Scrum Master is the champion for the development team. So if we step back and we look at out in the real world, when you get on the job, your team is not going to have just a product owner, Scrum Master, UI, UX people, and developers. You might have QA analysts, you might have data scientists, you will have other people, what we call stakeholders, managers and finance people and accountants who are paying for the project, as well as end users. I've worked on multiple projects where we actually had an end user assigned to the development team, and they were assigned to us as a resource we could ask questions of. So they sat, in our little block of cubes, our cubicles, and were there, throughout the business day to help us resolve issues and questions. And they were also, by the way, they were just instrumental in helping with testing. I really liked it when an end user was part of the team. But in any event, when you get out in the real world, you'll find that there's often certain types of friction that occurs. Things like maybe accounting is saying, "Oh, your project's over budget. You've got to cut back on what you're spending." Well, it's not the job of the UI UX designers or the developers to worry about that. That falls to the Scrum Master to be the champion for your team and to make sure that blocker and also that friction gets removed so that you can focus on actually developing the project or the product, I should say. Now, UI UX designers and developers within the context of Chingu Voyages, they're also referred to as the development team. And again, when you get out in the real world, your development team could have an end user assigned to you. You could have a QA analyst assigned, or a data scientist, or some other types of roles. But the people that are actually developing the product, they're called the development team. And again, at Chingu, that's going to be one or more UI UX designers and then some number of developers. So in essence, at a very high level, this is what your Voyage team will look like. And these are the high level responsibilities of everyone in these particular roles. So any questions before we go on? And by the way, feel free to speak up, or you can type questions in the chat box in Google Meet. And I love questions. I love that level of sharing. I think we all learn a lot more when there's that type of interaction. Okay, we'll just move on then. Let me make sure I'm in the right screen. So one other thing to think about, and this is specific to Chingu, and this is a question: does anybody know who's the boss of the Voyage team? Who's the manager? Who's the person that's telling everyone what to do? Any guesses? Okay, I'll tell you. There is no boss in a Voyage team. In Chingu Voyages, we've intentionally structured it so that there is no management hierarchy. Everyone, regardless of your role in a team, is at the same level. So, yeah, that's a good answer, Latondra. It's everyone on the team helps to coordinate. Now, out in the real world, your product owner will probably be your manager, or at least have some management responsibilities. There may also be a specific manager assigned to the team, though, as well. But we don't do that in Chingu, and we intentionally don't do that because we're trying to make it harder. Um, in Chingu, to get things done, product owners and scrum masters have to motivate the team. They basically work through motivation rather than by some type of carrot and stick approach. And that's a lot harder to do than if we had a manager that could just say, you do this or you're out. You're fired like we have in the real world. But the reason we've done that is because you're going to learn more from that level of difficulty than you would if we had just assigned a manager. And what you learn here will translate to the real world. It'll make you a better manager and a better team member, when you're on the job. And that strikes a lot of people as odd, but that's we've had pretty good success with this. Pardon me. And there's another roundtable that we'll do probably in another couple months on team conflict. And we'll give you some strategies and some techniques that when conflicts do occur or just disagreements, how do you handle those? So real quick, let's talk about one difference between a Chingu Voyage and again, what you might encounter out in the workplace on a development team and for a company. And that is this concept of primary and shadow responsibilities. So for product owners and scrum masters, there is a primary product owner and a primary scrum master. There'll only be one primary assigned. Now, again, they aren't bosses. They're not managers. They're at the same level as everyone on the team, but their purpose is to mentor and coach shadow product owners or shadow scrum masters. And in fact, let's just put that up. So the difference between these two roles, the primary and the shadow, is the primary is a product owner or a scrum master who they've been through at least one voyage, or they have a certification or some prior relevant job experience. They're basically people who are very well versed in the responsibilities of their role. Now, the shadow is someone that doesn't have that level of experience. They're a little earlier in their career path, so they may not have a formal certification. And quite frankly, they may not have participated in a team before. They're just not at that stage of their career yet. So the primaries, their job is to mentor and coach the shadows. So they are, in addition to helping coordinate the team, they're also working with the shadow to answer questions and to give them small assignments to let them build up experience and also to build up confidence so that they can lead a team or help coordinate a team in a future voyage. Now, the shadows, their responsibilities are to observe, but to be an active observer. They're going to ask, they should be asking questions of their primary. However, they are a passive teammate. So while they should be attending team meetings, and they can speak up some, they should make sure that the rest of the team is looking to the primary as the coordinator, if you will. So they don't want to take responsibility away from the primary in the eyes of the rest of the team. Now, again, I think it's very important. One of the tasks of the primary is when you see that, if you have a shadow, that your shadow is ready to do some tasks. Maybe it's something like a shadow product owner coordinating a sprint planning session. You might want to do just a little bit of coaching, answer some questions that the shadow may have, but assign that task to them so that they can build up experience. So any questions on primaries and shadows? Okay. And again, this is unique to Chingu. This is not something that you're probably going to see out in I keep saying the real world, but when you get a job in a company and you're assigned to a development team, you probably won't see shadows there. All right, next, let's start talking about the different Scrum events and what everyone's responsibility is in those events. So the first this is an overview of the events. The ones we're really going to talk about, we're going to talk about the sprint planning session. We're going to talk about this process that occurs of doing that incremental development and delivery. And then we're going to take a dive into the sprint review and the sprint retrospective. Now, keep in mind as we go through these, while it's important that you understand the responsibilities for your role, it's a good idea to understand, what are the responsibilities of the other roles on your team. And what that does is that lets you work better together because you'll know, what are those boundaries that you shouldn't step over. For example, if I'm a developer in a team, I'm going to back up a few slides. If I'm a developer in a team, I don't want to try to manage the product backlog. That's the product owner's job. As you'll see, my responsibility, I want to give some input to both the Scrum Master and the product owner on the backlog, but I don't want to try to take control of the backlog. That's the job of the product owner. So that's why I say it's good to understand, what, at least at a high level, what everyone else's role entails. So any questions before we go on? Okay, let's dive into, I forgot I animated these parts. Yeah, just one note, Scrum events used to be called ceremonies in the original version of Scrum. They're now called events. And so I've been working really hard to update my terminology because when I got my Scrum certification, they were still called ceremonies. And it's been tough for me to stop saying that. But if you hear someone say ceremony, just understand they mean Scrum event. All right, let's go through event by event and look at roles and responsibilities. So the first one we're going to look at is sprint planning. So again, the goal of sprint planning and the process is at the beginning of the voyage, you and your product owner, you will have built this product backlog that contains the product backlog items, basically the description of the work that needs to be performed. But this could be quite lengthy. You could have 100 items in your product backlog. But in each individual sprint, you don't have time to consider all 100 of those. So the purpose of the sprint planning session is to look at the backlog and decide, as a team, to decide what are the things that we really need to do right now. And so what you'll do is you'll identify those, you'll create a sprint backlog with just those items in it, and then members of the team, the development team, will volunteer to complete those items. So that's essentially the process you go through. And there's a lot of nuances. There's a lot of different techniques you can use to get from this point to the sprint backlog. But what we're going to focus on is just the responsibilities. So the goal of the sprint planning session is you're answering this question: are we doing what we need to do at this point in time? Are we doing the right things at the right time? And again, one of the reasons you pull these items you're going to work on in the current sprint out is so that you can focus on just these and not everything in the product backlog. So first of all, what is it that everyone has to do? Well, before you even start sprint planning, everyone should evaluate, should think about what's the progress that we've made. What are things like what are our product backlog items? Epics, user stories, and tasks that maybe have carried over from the prior sprint because we didn't finish them. You need to identify and think about those. It's also a good thing to set a sprint goal. Things like, well, in sprint 3, our first in a voyage anyway, that's our first sprint where you really are developing code. We want our goal to be to create the landing page and the general components for every page. Things like your header and your footer and your navigation and whatnot. In a later sprint, your goal might be to well, as in the case for the Voyage 54 application, your sprint goal may be to create that page that has the pentagram AI prompts on it. Or perhaps your goal is we actually, for the first time, we want to format the user input and call the Gemini API with that prompt in order to get some answer back. So it's good to set a sprint goal, or you might think of this as a theme for the sprint. Now, it's also really important for everyone to create a definition of done. Now, if I'm on a team with Michaela and Latondra, we're not going to have individual goals. This create everything that you see should be done at a team level. So we should we should all participate in coming up with a team definition of what is done. And you might think, oh, well, that's really simple. Why are you even calling this out? I can't tell you the number of projects I've been on where we get to the end of the project and we don't know whether or not we're done. I mean, we know that lots of stuff works, but we lost sight of what is it that the end user considers to be done, or what is the end user's definition of done. So that's why this is so important. Now, the product owner, one of their responsibilities before you even really start into coding is they're going to help to identify user requirements and features and to create an initial product backlog from that list of features. Now, this is a little, depending on what you think is easy and what is hard, it's a little more straightforward out in the real world because you'll have real end users, and your real end users will tell you what they want. So the PO's job is to sort through that to identify and to help prioritize those items. In a voyage, you don't have a real end user. So the team as a whole, sometimes you're playing the role of end user, and sometimes you're playing the role of a development team. And I'm using development team in a very broad sense to encompass all these roles. But that can be difficult to do that kind of mode switching. Now, once you're in development, and again, we're going to take this from the strict Scrum definition. In the real world, as changes occur, as your stakeholders, as your end users come up with new features that they think they need, or as their priorities may change, as a product owner, you have to be on top of that to make sure that the backlog accurately represents or gets updated to represent what the user needs. Now, stakeholder means everyone involved in the project. So the other type of update that can occur is from the developers or the UI UX designers. You may have come up with a wireframe, for example, that says we want to use red as a background color for all of our buttons. And so you get into development, and then your UI UX designer says, oh, I just read this article that 14% of the world's population suffers from some type of color blindness. And of that 14%, a good part of that is people that specifically have a red color blindness. In other words, they can't see text and whatnot in red. Um, so the UI UX designer may get with the Scrum Master and the PO and point this out. So a change is required. The backlog says, oh, we're going to have a red background or red lettering, and now you need to change that. Well, that's the PO's job to make sure that that change gets made. Another job of the PO is to identify risks. Uh, and broadly, this is what we call risk mitigation. That's the term for this. Basically, one of the things the PO thinks about is what are all the things that could go wrong? And then the PO can prioritize that based upon, okay, what are the things that are actually likely to go wrong in this list? And then devote some time to coming up with workarounds or processes that you would put into play if that risk actually arises, if it's what we call realized. So, for example, a risk might be, let's say you're developing a tax application, and one of the risks may be, well, the federal government changes the tax law. Well, that's a pretty uh, a pretty likely risk, I should say. Those tax laws change all the time. So, you need to be prepared with, what are we going to do if this happens? So it's not just identifying the risks, it's identifying risks and coming up with some type of high level plan for not how are we going to solve it, but what are we going to do if it actually happens so that we can resolve it. Now, the Scrum Master, their job is to help the team understand the scope, the goals, and the priorities, and also to coach the team and to make sure the team is following at a high level, following the Scrum process. But the Scrum Master, you can think of them as a bridge between the PO and the development team. So the PO is helping to build the product backlog and prioritize it. The Scrum Master is making sure that the team understands, the priorities and then the scope and the goals of each of the tasks. Now, the PO and the Scrum Master, I've always said that they need to be joined at the hip. Basically, they have to work really closely together. So when changes arise, they need to coordinate with the PO. And this is primarily from the development team side. When the dev team identifies some change that needs to be made to the backlog or something that has happened that affects the backlog, the Scrum Master is the one that's going to be working with the PO on that. Because a lot of times POs aren't necessarily technical. The Scrum Master may have to translate, to help the PO understand, what this thing is, what this change, required change is, and what the best way to resolve it is. And then finally, the development team, they take these high level product backlog items, and they're doing the detail work of breaking them down into individual tasks. Now, they're also going to review the product backlog for current sprint tasks. Basically, let's say that in the sprint planning session, this actually goes beyond the sprint planning session. Let's say that I volunteer to do part of the profile page, and I complete my assignment, but the sprint hasn't ended yet. Well, what I should do is review that product backlog or the sprint backlog to see, okay, what what's remaining, what work hasn't been started yet, and then work with my Scrum Master and my PO to basically so I can start working on that. So as a development team member, when you complete something, your job is not finished for that sprint. As a team player, you need to look at, okay, what can I help with next? Now, the other thing that the development team does is once they've broken down these individual tasks uh, or these individual product backlog items into detailed tasks, then they need to assign some type of completion target. In many cases at Chingu, saying, "Oh, well, the current sprint is the target, is the reasonable target," that's good enough. Um, I think where this is really important in a voyage is when you've created the product backlog, you may have said, "Oh, well, this is a user story." But when the dev team actually starts working on that, they may realize, this is way bigger than a user story. Maybe this is actually an epic that needs to be broken down into multiple user stories. Well, this is an area where they need to coordinate with the Scrum Master and also the PO, but to coordinate with the Scrum Master so that they know, what this change is. Hey, we need to break this user story into an epic and maybe 3 additional user stories. And then the Scrum Master, that gives them something to work with to get that update made in the backlog through the PO. Now, the other thing that can happen is when you're breaking down these tasks, you may see that, yeah, we can complete this task in this sprint, but this is going to require someone that knows Postgres, Postgres database. And I'm not the best one for that, even though I have ownership of this task right now. So that's a case where you go to your Scrum Master and you point out that fact, and you might recommend. You may say, well, Agile knows a lot about Postgres. Maybe we should work on this together, and then that way the work will get done. But then I can pick up more Postgres knowledge, so I could do this on my own, in a later sprint. So any questions on this? Again, we're going through this at a fairly high level. The intent is not to show every single thing that you might do, but to point out, what should your mindset be?
I have a question.
Certainly.
Um, doesn't the work of a Scrum Master make the Scrum Master the leader of the team?
I'm sorry. Let me turn my volume up. I didn't catch all that. I apologize. Could you repeat that again?
Doesn't the work of a Scrum Master technically make the Scrum Master the leader of the team?
I saw. So you said, does the Scrum Master technically what?
Doesn't the work of the Scrum Master technically make him or her the leader of the team?
I'm going to ask you. Could you type that? I apologize. I'm having trouble picking up what you're saying. In the Google Meet, there's a chat. If you could type that real quick, I'll answer that for you. I just want to make sure I understand what you're saying or what you're asking. Pardon me. So while we're waiting on that, as you can see, everyone has to work really closely together, and communication is absolutely critical here. So let's see. Doesn't the work of the Scrum Master technically make him or her the team leader? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. So again, in the real world, there's a lot of truth to that. You'll often see that Scrum Masters take on some type of lead role. But in Chingu, we intentionally don't do that. And again, the reason we don't do that is we want your we want everyone's work at coordinating uh, team activities to be done through motivation, because that's much harder than if you're actually in a like an employee boss type of relationship. And again, we've seen a lot of cases. I've seen it myself where projects where I've had to motivate the team through just that motivation. Um, it's turned out to be much harder, but I've learned more and the team has learned more. And again, at Chingu, um, we don't really have the ability to say this person is the boss. You know? So that's a good question. I'm glad you've asked that, and I hope that helps. Any other questions or observations for that matter? Okay, let's move on. So let's look at what are some best practices, for the sprint planning session, and specifically around, centered around these roles. Well, the product owner and the scrum master, while they aren't bosses, they are leaders. Okay, so they aren't formal leaders. It's not like a reporting structure or hierarchy, but they definitely have to show uh, leadership capabilities. So one of the things that's really important is to create a safe environment. Uh, Sorry, this and sign shouldn't have been there, but create a safe environment. Now, by safe, what we really mean is an environment where everyone on the team feels free to speak, to comment, to give criticisms, even to point out bugs or flaws, but to do it without fear of being attacked. What we're working for here in the Voyage and at Chingu in general, we don't want that Reddit type of environment where somebody makes a post and then hundreds of people, just start the attacks. That's not what we're about. And we feel very strongly we have to have this concept of a safe environment for people to basically effectively communicate and collaborate. The other thing the PO and Scrum Master will do is they have to set the expectations. They're working from the product backlog, um, and from that, they're making sure that the development team understands, what needs to be done, but not just, what needs to be done, but how it should be done. Things like testing and documentation, things like that, setting those expectations. They should also be asking open-ended questions. Back in the old days of Scrum, I mean, literally 25 years ago, Scrum Masters were actually developers, and the Scrum Master job was like a second job that they held down in a team. More and more, what you see out in industry is the Scrum Master is a totally separate role, and there are a lot of Scrum Masters that aren't necessarily technical. Um, so one of their jobs, and this is true of the PO as well, is when there's a problem arises or a blocker, to ask the open-ended questions, to ask simple questions to make sure that the team is thinking about how to get around this blocker from multiple different aspects, and to make sure, they haven't forgotten something simple. They also need to set realistic goals, you know, and this is really a lot of this rides on the product owner. When you build the product backlog, you're going to need a lot of input from your team to make sure that, a user story is something that can be completed in a single sprint or at most 2 sprints. So that's where you're going to need the technical expertise of the team, to help define just that, a realistic goal. As part of creating that safe environment, you also want to acknowledge uh, and explore ideas. One of the things about Agile um, is that it adapts to change. It doesn't resist change. And because of that, things are going to come up in every sprint that weren't expected. So it's really, you need to help your team uh, adapt to those changes. And part of that is coming up with ideas on how to resolve problems or how to take a different approach to something. You should also monitor the progress of your team. Everyone on the development team, the developers, I should say, they should be contributing in each sprint. They should be doing commits. They should be writing code, committing their code to GitHub, creating pull requests. So those are things that can be monitored, and that's a good practice. That's a best practice for POs and Scrum Masters to monitor those types of things so that they can coach people when they're not contributing. Let's see, Nika asked, how could developers deliver a valuable increment during the first sprint? Well, it really depends on what you consider to be a valuable increment. Now, for the first sprint, I think the most valuable increments are really two things: to deliver the product backlog and the wireframe. And I say first sprint. In a Chingu Voyage, that'd be the first two sprints. But definitely, in any project, your increment that you deliver in the earlier sprints won't be as uh, it won't be as pronounced as the deliverables you have in later sprints because you're going to be setting the foundation. So it's going to be hard. Sometimes it's very hard to track progress in the earlier sprints when you're setting up databases or you're defining the landing page. I mean, those are just as valuable as other activities. Don't get me wrong, but they are often viewed as not being as important as other things, even though they are. So I hope that helped. Another really important thing that product owners and Scrum Masters should document the decisions that the team makes. I've made this mistake so many times where in a team meeting we come to a decision and we don't write it down. I don't write it down. And then 2 weeks later, we're asking the question, well, what was this decision? And, you know, uh, Michaela has one definition of what the decision was. Nika has a different definition. Everybody on the team remembers something differently. So it's really important as major decisions are made to keep track of those, to write them down, and to share them with the team so everybody knows what the decision is or was. And then finally, you need to be wise about the artifacts, basically the documentation that you're maintaining for your application. It needs to be appropriate to your tier. So for a tier 3 team, I think it'd be a really good thing to use story points, for example. But that's not necessarily a good decision for a tier 1 team because tier 1 teams are at the beginning of their journey to become developers and UI UX designers and product owners. It's more important that tier 1 teams do things in a more simplified way because that helps them get the foundations down. It helps them learn the foundations. And then as you advance through the tiers, then you can add on, again, things like story points. The other thing this applies to, it's not just your artifacts appropriate to your tier, but think about the level of documentation you're maintaining. I've seen teams that have fantastic documentation. They've got Google Drives just full of documents that document the project, but they don't have any code because they used all their time to build the documentation rather than to build the code. So what you want to do is keep an eye to that, remember that, and make sure that your documentation is only what you need and nothing more. And in the dev team, again, a big part of your job is to help the product owner and scrum master refine these product backlog items as you discover new information. Again, a product owner may have defined a user story that says create a profile page. But then, as a developer, when I volunteer to do that task, I discover, well, this profile information has to be stored someplace. So we're going to need a database, and that means we need to define the database. We need to create test data for it. We need to create a schema for it. We need to create a process to reload the test data when it needs to be refreshed. Oh, by the way, we're going to need three different types of activities. We're going to need an add, an update, and a delete, which are three separate, uh, again, buttons on a screen. So anyway, so all of a sudden, this thing has grown from being one user story to being an epic with probably four user stories underneath it. So again, it's your responsibility. Once you identify that, communicate that back to your Scrum Master and potentially your PO so that the product backlog can be updated to be more accurate. You also want to share your concerns, opinions, and what you see as risks. Um, I'll give you one specific example where I've seen teams fail on this. Many times, developers and even UI UX people as well, um, when there's something that you don't know, you tend to be very shy and withdrawn about letting someone else know that. And so what happens is you tend to procrastinate. You tend to put off working on a task. You might be spending a lot of time studying, so that you can be ready to work on that task. But as a result, the project starts running over schedule, because something isn't being completed as fast as it should be. So in a case like that, that's a concern. That's actually a concern and a risk. That's something that the better approach is to let your team know, hey, I volunteered for this, and I can do, part X of this, but I don't know how to do part Y, and I need help. Well, what happens is there's no shame in that. What's going to happen is you're going to learn more by doing that because someone else on the team is going to be available to help. That also is a good example for raising issues and questions, in a timely manner. Um, I've seen, I've done this myself, run into a bug and fall into this trap of thinking, I'm only an hour away from fixing this. I think I know what the issue is. I think I know what the fix is. So I put in that fix and it doesn't correct the issue. So then I think some more. I go, well, now I think I'm only 2 hours away from it. And before you know it, you've spent days working on a problem by yourself when had you raised it and let the rest of the team know what was going on, someone else may know the answer already, or at least be able to help you. And then the final thing I've seen that's a this is one of those kind of negative best practices. It's something don't do. Um, Everyone, when you start on a project, you have a lot of energy and you want to contribute. And so that energy and enthusiasm translates into overcommitting. So remember that when you commit in the sprint planning session to do some work, that should be work that you could reasonably expect to finish in that sprint. And remember, there's no downside to rather than volunteering to do three tasks, to do one task. Because if you complete that one task, let's say you complete it by Thursday of the sprint. Well, Now you can go back to your Scrum Master and say, hey, I finished this. What can I work on next? And then they can assign a different task to you or a new task to you. So that basically, by not overcommitting, you actually get more done. So any questions on the sprint planning side of this? Oh, let me look
I think
here.
I have.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you mentioned about story points, and so basically I've never used story points. And let's say you're working with a team that hasn't used story points before. Like, how do you get to implement story points? Like, I've read about it, but I've never used it. Probably because I've never worked with a team that's fond of using story points. Like, they've never used it. So, like, how do you get to implement story points?
So that's actually something that in a Voyage or in any project, that's something your Scrum Master will help you with. So in a Voyage, um, I typically, it's not all the time or 100% of the time, but I typically see tier three teams are the ones that are using story points. But your Scrum Master is coaching the team and sometimes, in some cases, instructing the teams on here's what story points are and how to use them. So that's something that you'll pick up uh, through your Scrum Master. Now, just in general, I think in the in the Chingu handbook, if we go down to, I think it's Agile Methodology 101, I think there's an explanation of what story points are here. So this won't give you enough information. Oh, actually, it's not in here. I think I took that out. Now that I'm thinking about it. Um, yeah, I'm going to fall back. I think the best thing to do is work with your Scrum Master and they'll help coach you on how to use story points. Now, having said that, we do have a roundtable we've given in the past on story points. I don't know that we'll do that one before July, or actually before the middle of July. Um, but we're due to repeat that one here within the next few months. And there's a lot of
Okay.
yeah, there's a lot of articles and whatnot on story points that just explain what they are. But basically, a story point is a measure of complexity or difficulty. It is not a measure of time. Okay, it's not a measure of work. It's a measure of difficulty. Um, and when you're doing sprint planning, uh, when you take a PBI out of the backlog, like a user story out of the backlog, the team will estimate the development team will estimate what do they think the complexity of this is. So your sprint backlog, when that's completed, you've got all these user stories and tasks. They have story points assigned, and the difference between the story points really measures how complex is task A compared to task B. So that's kind of a textbook, a really high level definition of story points. There's a lot more. It takes about an hour to go through to show exactly what story points are and how you use them. Uh, but that's a quick overview. And again, what you do
Thank you.
then over time, if you're measuring how many story points do you complete in a given sprint, then over time you can use that average number of story points completed to measure your sprint backlog for the next sprint to say, well, is it in line? Is it doable or is it unrealistic? If our average number of story points we've completed in any sprint is 50, and all of a sudden in a sprint we say we're going to do 200, that's probably not reasonable. That you're probably not going to get that much work done. So let's see. Michaela asked, we're all learning. There's no shame in not knowing something. Absolutely. I make mistakes absolutely every day. A good day for me is when I only make 3 mistakes. And I always, the key to a mistake is not making the mistake. It's what do you learn from it? All right, let's move on in the interest of time here because I'm talking too much. So now let's talk about this development event. This process you go through in a sprint to create a deliverable piece of work. And by deliverable, it's something you can deploy that your end user can use. Now, it's not the finished product, it's not the MVP, but it is a workable version of the product up to this point. And technically, this is an activity rather than an event. Uh, I've had a number of Scrum Masters tell me this is not an event, and they are true or they are correct. It's not. It's an activity, but I think it's still important to talk about it. So while you're doing the development, it's everyone's responsibility to stay focused on completing the sprint backlog. Don't worry about everything that's in the product backlog. There's an old saying, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. Well, that's what your sprints are. They're one bite. So that the whole project, your MVP is an elephant, and you're working to complete it one sprint at a time. Now, another thing that's absolutely critical that everyone should do is post your daily your stand up in a team channel. Most Voyage teams, because of everyone's schedule, it's really, really difficult to hold a sprint planning set or a sprint planning, to hold a stand up meeting every single day, a real time meeting. So what we've done is we've created a bot called /standup. And in any channel, if you type /standup, it'll prompt you for 3 questions. What have I completed? What am I working on? And do I have any blockers? And when you fill those out, that gets posted in that channel. So if you do that every day in your team channel, that gives your team a real good view of, what are you working on in relation to what they're working on and what's your progress. The other thing it does is if I report that I have a blocker, that's a really good opportunity for one of my team members to reach out to me to say, can I help? And then the other thing that's important for everyone is to test the product. As you're coding, don't forget it's not just about writing code, it's about testing the results. So let's see, Zuli asked, what happens to the leftover product backlog when the project ends? So as long as the minimum viable product is reached, anything that's left over in the product backlog should be have a lower priority. There should not be any must-have tasks left. So everything else basically rolls over into maintenance mode. So I hope that again, that's another one of those questions. Really, a lot of complex answers can come out of that, but that's generally what you're working for in a project. The total sum of all of your must-have product backlog items, that's the definition of what's in the MVP. And everything else, a nice to have or a should have, it's great if you can complete those, but they aren't required to finish the MVP. Oops. All right, so the product owner, again, what they should be doing is monitoring the team's progress and against the sprint backlog and sharing what that progress is. I think something that we haven't done in the past at Chingu that we should, in Voyages anyway, is we should be recommending that our product owners, that when someone completes a product backlog item, like, let's say that Zooey completes the user story for the profile page, the PO should be posting congratulations in the team channel. It's good to recognize the team members. And then the other thing, we've kind of beat this one to death, but the product backlog, when the dev team and the Scrum Master and the UI UX designer, when they come up with refinements to the product backlog, the PO needs to make sure that they review those, they ask questions, and they get the details they need from the team, but to make sure that the product backlog gets updated with the decisions that are made about that change, and it should reflect, accurately reflect what needs to be done. So the Scrum Masters also monitor progress. Now, while the PO is monitoring the progress against the backlog, and some terms you'll learn about that POs can use are things like burn down charts and burn up charts. But the Scrum Master, they're monitoring progress at the code level. So they're making sure that everyone is number one, that they're following Scrum, but that number two, they're committed, they're doing commits as they make changes. And as they have completed units of work, they're doing the unit testing, and they're creating PRs, pull requests, so that other people on the team can review those changes. They're also keeping a real close eye on, are there any blockers? Is there any problems that team members are running into that they need some help? And so their job is to help support the team in finding the resolutions. Now, again, Scrum Masters aren't necessarily technical, so their job isn't to know the answer. Their job is to coordinate both inside and outside the team to find the resources to help the team member, resolve the issue. And then finally, again, just as we talked about it earlier, when there's changes to the backlog, they need to provide the feedback to the PO. They need to let the PO know, hey, here's what we think needs to happen to the product backlog. Maybe there's some new bit of information we've found that makes this task more complex. Or maybe we found that, hey, you know what, this isn't as complex as what we thought. And because it's at a relatively low level in coding, this change is going to affect a lot of different backlog items. So then the individual members of the development team, these are developers and the UI UX designer, they need to provide, again, that product backlog feedback to the Scrum Master. They need to support one another and share information as they learn it. They need to volunteer for new tasks when they complete the current task. And also when they see a team member that is struggling with an issue of some type, they need to reach out and volunteer to help. And then finally, the development team is really responsible for getting the code, getting the product to a point that by the end of each sprint, you can deploy it to production. So you may not be at you will not be at the minimum viable product status until the end of the project. But by deploying to production, this gives you something you can actually test against. As an end user, you can use the product from the viewpoint of an end user and maybe you discover problems. Maybe you discover, hey, here's a technique that we used in one part of the app that we should be using in all parts of the application. So, and I had something else and it slipped out of my head. I'm trying to remember it. It'll come back to me. So in any event, these are the responsibilities during this development cycle for everyone on the team. Any questions? Okay, let's talk about best practices. So again, product owner and scrum master support the development team. Your job is to make sure that the development team can focus on the coding. Um, the other thing that you should do is, again, when changes occur or identified, make sure the backlog is updated and that it adapts to changing conditions. And then at Chingu Voyages, unfortunately, there are many times that there will be a teammate who doesn't communicate. So especially as a product, well, as both a product owner and scrum master, really keep an eye on, who's not communicating, who maybe hasn't posted anything in the team channel for a couple days, and then reach out to them through a private DM. Make sure that you report that back on the weekly check-in so the admin team can reach out to that person, and basically try to keep everyone motivated and moving forward. Now, for the development team, best practices is to be very open about sharing information and issues, and do it as soon as they come up. Don't wait to share that information or to report that information. Also, tasks aren't done until or when they're coded. They're done when they're unit tested and successfully PR'd. I've seen a lot of teams that will mark a task as done when the PR is created. Well, a task isn't done until the PR is actually approved and merged into the main branch. That's when that task is complete. And because of that, I've seen teams that report to management, oh, we're making this great progress, we're way ahead of schedule. And then it comes down to release date and management finds out, well, you know what? The product's not ready yet because they reported completion way ahead of time. So let's see, Private Anon says, product owners and scrum masters making sure that devs are focused on the job is something crucial that I just realized. Yeah, this was an issue in our last voyage. Yeah, a lot of times I've seen this because product owners and scrum masters aren't necessarily technical. Sometimes they give the development team a little too much leeway. It's okay for product owners and scrum masters to ask questions. If a development team member says, hey, let's say you're in sprint 5, and a development team member says, well, we were using this one library, but we've decided we want to use a totally different library. Well, the question I would ask is either a product owner or a scrum master is, okay, we're in sprint 5. The product is based on this particular library, and now you want to pull it out and use a different library. Why do you think that work can be completed this late in the project? So it's okay to ask a question like that that's very frank, very pointed, as long as you're still respectful. But that's a really good question I would ask, and that's a case where it's the product owners, or it's an example of how the product owners and scrum masters can help keep the team focused. Again, development team members should volunteer to help their teammates and to share what you've learned. Now, one other best practice I don't have on here that I should have, a lot of, in voyages especially, UI UX designers are really busy in the first 3 to 4 sprints, but once that wireframe is totally defined and maybe they've created the CSS or whatnot or Tailwind constructs or components, then their activity drops off. I think it's a really good idea to have the UI UX designers participate in PR reviews. Basically to take a look at, is the design that we came up with actually what's being implemented? And if it's not being implemented, there might be a really good reason for that. But let's make sure that that change is being implemented across the entire application, not just in one spot. So let's see. Hi, Snowbites. Yeah, Nika said in a past voyage that her team was not pushing to main in a timely manner, and you regretted it. Yeah, that's a common thing, and that's a good lesson to learn. There's nothing wrong in making that mistake because that's one that you probably won't forget for a long, 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 long time. All right, any questions? Yeah, getting the product backlog down is important. It doesn't have to be 100% because your product backlog changes in every sprint because you're continually learning. But, the things that you start to work on, they should be, fairly well defined before you start working on them. All right, let's move on. We're going to wrap up by talking about the sprint review and the sprint retrospective. So the sprint review, that's a Scrum event that occurs at the end of the sprint. And in the real world, what it is you get together, the development team gets together with real end users to basically demonstrate the product up to that point in time and get their feedback. And that's actually really, really valuable because in older project methodologies like waterfall, you didn't get those reviews at the end of each sprint. Sometimes you would get them maybe monthly, maybe depending on the length of the project, maybe every 3 months, or maybe just at the end of the project. And that's why so many projects, when the review wasn't done on a regular basis with your end users, you'd get surprises. You get to the end of the project and find, oh, we missed a requirement. So now we've got a product that's not usable. We have to go back, implement that requirement. We're probably going to have to work overtime. We're going to be under a lot of pressure from management to get it done. Our end users are going to be aggravated at us, even though they didn't tell us what the requirement was. There's a lot of bad things that can happen by not doing these types of reviews on a regular basis. Now, in a voyage, because we don't have real end users, you and your teammates are going to have to play the role of the end user. So the sprint review shouldn't be about technology. It should be about walking through the application to make sure it delivers the value that you promised that it would, the end user value. And again, that's what it's all about. This meeting, this particular event, is about making sure that you've met the needs and expectations of your users. And a better way to think about this, you're making sure that the people who are paying your paycheck that their needs are being met. So what are the responsibilities? Okay, again, as I said, you want to look at it through the eyes of an end user. You're looking at the executable application, not the technology behind it. It doesn't matter that you're using React over Laravel or that you're using Mongo instead of Postgres. That doesn't matter. End users do not care about technology. All they care about is what is the application doing that helps save me time and money. And again, that's that last part. Function on the usability and functionality instead of technology. Now, the product owner in a real world setting, the product owner, I've worded this really badly. I apologize. They're not going to necessarily present the completed work. They're going to coordinate the meeting. Okay. And so that will be making sure that the right people are invited. It also makes sure that it's not just the PO and the Scrum Master that are showing the product to the end user. It's making sure that the developers responsible for a particular feature are doing that demonstration. That will be very difficult for certain developers because many of us are introverts, but that's something that really builds a valuable skill that you can use throughout your career. It also, I want to stop when everyone has a role in presenting the completed work, um, that helps to build confidence. Um, So I think that's something else that's really important about that. The other thing it does, it helps you, like as a developer, it will help you build a relationship with specific end users. So they're going to be, when you have that relationship, they're going to be more open to working with you, to bringing new ideas to you, maybe to reporting problems. Uh, but it's going to make things better, even though it's really hard to build those kinds of skills. So again, you're making the PO is making sure that uh, that the requirements and expectations in the backlog are being met. It's also making sure that as your end user points out flaws and problems, uh, that the backlog is being updated with those. Those are work items that need to be corrected. And then finally, again, you want to recognize the achievements of the development team with the end users. You want to applaud the development team. And when things go really, really well, it's also good to applaud the end users. If they've done a good job at providing requirements and they're stable requirements, that's actually something to celebrate. Because I can tell you, many, many projects, there's been a number of them I've been on. We get to the end and we find there's some requirement the end users never told us about. So again, Scrum Masters are there to make sure that when the developers are presenting, that they're focusing on the usability. And they're going to do this in a very gentle way. Like if I'm presenting and I start talking about the profile screen I've built, and all of a sudden I go off script and I start talking about, yeah, we built this Postgres database with 50 tables and 300 relationships between the tables. And my Scrum Master needs to step in and say, "Oh, Jim, thank you. That's important, but we want to make sure we show our users what the application actually does for them." So that's just an example of staying focused. And then finally, everyone should be taking notes. I actually should probably have that over in the all section. But the Scrum Master is supporting the product owner by making sure that they are keeping a record of issues and decisions as well. So that after the meeting, the PO and the Scrum Master can compare notes to make sure that nothing was missed. And then the development team, they're going to exercise the application in production. So they're going to show the end users, here's what we've done up to this point. And again, as the users make comments on during the review, the developers are going to keep notes as well on, oh, we missed this, or this is something we could have done differently on a particular screen to help the end user. After the meeting, they'll feed that back to their Scrum Master. The product backlog will get updated. And at the next review, you can show your end user the progress. You can say, hey, last week or last month or whatever your sprint cycle is, you said you needed this. We've implemented this. What do you think? Give us some feedback. Any questions? Okay. I think I'm all caught up on comments. So the last piece of this, our kind of fourth event, is the retrospective. This is the part of Scrum that I've learned to value the most. What the retrospective is, it's in traditional Scrum out of the real world, it's just the development team and the Scrum Master. They're getting together and they're reviewing not what they did, but how they did the work. So they're identifying things that didn't go smoothly. And so they can focus on, okay, how do we improve on these in the next sprint? Conversely, it's okay to point out something like, well, this went really, really well. We need to make sure that we continue to do this. And so how might we monitor this? Maybe we need a metric to measure this. Or maybe we have that metric and we've exceeded our goals, so we need to raise the threshold on that metric. Uh, a good example of that is time taken to complete a PR review. So measure the time from when the PR was created to when it was approved. That time should be as short as possible. Now, the focus shouldn't be just to shorten the time. It's to shorten the time and maintain the same level of quality of review. So you might want to tie that metric to the number of bug reports, uh, filed against a particular release, because that'll tell you, okay, yeah, we shortened the sprint review or the PR review, but we're generating more bugs, which tells us, we're not doing a good job at reviewing. So again, the retrospective is all about getting better and how well you're working together. At a prior company of mine, we had an entire project built around this across multiple departments called The Way We Work. And the whole focus was on improving our how we did the work, but also our relationships across departments. All right, so how do you do a retrospective? Well, first of all, you have to be open and honest. So you want to always be respectful, but you don't want to try to do what we call sugarcoating. You don't want to try to minimize the impact of something that's very serious. You need to be very honest about it, but also factual. Stick to the facts over your feelings. Another way of saying that is you want to be quantitative versus qualitative, and it's all about leaving your ego at the door. You know, uh, in a sprint retrospective, a lot of times something may be pointed out that's something maybe Jim is doing wrong or Jim could be better at. Rather than reacting as, "Oh my God, I'm being attacked. Why are you saying that?" I think the better perspective is, "Oh, thank you for that. That's a gift. You're telling me something I can improve on. That's going to help me in the rest of my career. And for our particular project, it'll make our project go smoother." So if we get down into specific roles, technically, again, the PO is not part of the sprint retrospective out in the workplace. But I think in a Chingu Voyage, this PO should participate. Chingu Voyages are fairly small teams. Everyone is working together very closely. I mean, you should be bonding together, actually. You don't have to like your teammates, but you have to be able to work with them. So I think the PO plays a big enough role in Chingu Voyages that you really need to make sure that they are included in the retrospective. Now, however, the responsibility for coordinating the retrospective falls to the Scrum Master because this is a Scrum event. So they should be identifying, and working with the team to identify what are the topics for the upcoming sprint retrospective. You shouldn't just schedule the meeting and then no one think about what are you going to talk about until the meeting starts. You should identify some type of agenda before the meeting starts. Now, in the meeting, what you will do is the whole team, everyone will discuss these items, and you'll basically come up with a proposal or an action plan for here's what we're going to do in the next sprint to address this issue. So the Scrum Master needs to make sure that if there are any changes to documentation or backlog or whatever, maybe one of the items is the the backlog items need to be defined a little more clearly. Well, that's something that they should communicate to the PO because the PO owns the backlog. And in every meeting, someone should be recording decisions and action items, but it's even more important in the retrospective to summarize what is it that you're going to do in the next sprint in the team channel. It needs to be in a place where everyone has access to this information. And in the development team, you're the ones that are really coming up with a lot of the ideas. You're discussing this. So you should be thinking about, for each item, what's worked well, what hasn't worked well, and then what do we do to improve this? Something like a PR review. If you're measuring the time from the time it takes a PR or from the time a PR is created to the time it's approved, and that average time per sprint is 72 hours, well, that's the majority of your sprint. That's definitely something's not right. So you need to think about, well, how can we improve? Well, maybe the improvement is something as simple as we're prioritizing coding over sprint reviews. So we need to turn that around and make sprint reviews, conducting them priority one and coding priority two. Any questions? Okay. We're at the end. Thank you for sticking with me. I know there was a lot here. Um, these are some, I'll post a slide deck out in the, which channel? I will put it in the town hall chat channel. Um, but these are links to different documents that might help explain some of this. Um, Again, I want to open it up to questions about this topic or anything at all. Anything that you have a question about or a problem with, you need some guidance, why, feel free to speak up, or you can type it in the uh, Google Meet chat. Let's see. Did these points make it in the handbook? Not to this level of detail, no. The handbook is an overview. Um, we do try to go into detail on the more important things, but at the same time, we're trying to balance or make the handbook something that's actually usable and readable during the voyage. So that's why we'll make this deck available, and then we'll also post the video out or on YouTube tomorrow morning. Oh, thank you, Zoe. I appreciate that. Yeah, it is recorded. It'll be on YouTube by tomorrow. And I will post an announcement in Pound Announcements with the link to the YouTube channel. Yeah, the handbook is pretty good size. That's why the last major update we did a couple weeks ago, we actually, we didn't remove any information, but we made the phrasing and the sentence structure hopefully much simpler and easier to consume. And we also reworded things in the handbook based upon we know that English is not everyone's first language. So we tried to eliminate complex terms and language whenever we could. All right, looks like there's no more questions. So again, thank you, everyone. Um, this was a quite long one. We went an hour and a half, but again, I appreciate your time. I really appreciate your questions, as always. Those are more valuable, I think, than any of the information we're presenting. So thank you for those. And with that, we will close this one out. Have a good rest of your day or your evening, and we will talk to you all later. Bye bye.